This will be a little backwards because I already got the pump out, but you can see here I am trying to get the pump placed in. You have to have a special tool for taking on and off the pulley. It just two pieces clip into a groove, and it's got a tin sleeve that fits over the top to hold it together. Then the screw down the center, you want to make sure it's in perfect because it's threaded inside that hole for putting the pulley back on. It has two different sizes on the collars. I believe one is for Ford and one is for GM. Want to make sure you got the right side on. And you just go in and you just start pulling and it comes off when you start screwing it down. And I didn't have the proper tool to put it back on. So what I did is got a couple of big thick washers that were bigger than the pulley itself. Put a bolt down in the hole. Got some spacers, which I used bigger nuts. I think I used 1/2 inch nuts. It's a 3-inch bolt that goes inside. And would screw down a ways, then pull it out, put another one in so I didn't strip any threads. And you can see me there putting the nut and washers on. And the outward edge of the pulley should be even with the top of the shaft to make the collar line up. One thing you want to do before you put the pulley back on is there are 3 bolts that hold the pump to the bracket. You can see I have in the vise. You have to put those bolts in before you put the pulley on. Otherwise, the bolts are too long and the pulley is too close. I know from experience. So I'm using a electric impact to help pull it down. And then I got out my speed square to make sure that the pulley was down to the top of the shaft. You kind of just have to go by feel. You want to make sure you got plenty of threads down inside that shaft, or you might strip them out because that pulley goes on hard. If you heat the center of that pulley a little bit, it will expand and go on easier, but you got to be pretty quick, otherwise it will contract and then it goes down hard again. So you can see here I didn't have enough washers on the top, and I sucked the nut down inside just a little bit, so I had to get a wrench and a socket that had the hex going all the way out the end of it to get the nut back out. One thing you definitely don't want to do is try and beat that pulley on with a hammer, otherwise you'll ruin the bearings and the rest of the pump surface inside, or dislodge them to a different place. In which case you'll be buying another power steering pump. Had I have put 2 or 3 more washers on the top when I started putting that pulley on with the bolt, it probably would have not convexed the bolt, so I could have gotten it off with a regular socket, but too late to realize that I did that. On final check, the pulley is down even with the top of the shaft, so the belt should line up when it goes back on. On the back side you have the valve for the high pressure input on the pump, which goes out to the power steering box to make it turn. It comes out. There's 3 O-rings on the shaft. You can slowly peel them off with a O-ring pick. Try not to damage them any. In some cases, they don't always send all the right parts. You can see there I'm taking there's a plastic shell that the high pressure hose screws into. It comes off and it's put the O-rings on, then it slips back down, and that's what keeps the pressure in to go out to the power steering pump. The O-rings are in the kit. As you can see there's 4 of them. 3 of them go on that shaft, and I believe 1 goes inside the plastic piece for the high pressure part. They're pretty close to the same size, so you want to be real careful when you take them off so you don't get scarring on the shaft itself. It should be hard enough that you shouldn't. When putting the O-rings back on, be careful that the top 2, which are the same size, that you don't hurt or stretch them out. You don't want to have any type of motor oil or anything get on them, because that can make them stretch a little bit. I use what's called Super Lube. It's a synthetic grease. That's what I'll grease the fittings up to make them slip and slide easier when we go to put that plastic collar back on that the high pressure pump goes into. You want to double check before you unscrew any of that out of the back of the pump to make sure you know where it belongs. When you put it back, well, the pressure hose will go into it because it's awful tight on there, and there isn't too much room for leeway to have it off, and it's real hard to move once it's already in there. The O-rings didn't look bad, so I usually try and take them, put them someplace. I got quite a stock of old used O-rings. You never know, someday you get something apart and can't get to a store or something, well, you might have to use them again. The plastic piece that the pressure hose goes into seats down on that shaft, and you have to look real close and get it pushed on real hard because it has both a C-ring, snap ring, and a regular snap ring. Both go in the groove. I'm not sure why they have 2, but they're real tight, and it's a real tight fit. To be able to get them both put back in, you might have to put the snap ring on and just tap down on it lightly with a punch or a screwdriver to make it get in and seal. A couple of the videos I watched, they pulled the power steering pump out without taking that bracket off, and I have absolutely no idea how they did it because I couldn't get those screws out that were behind that pulley. And to me it was just faster and easier to go ahead, and you have to pull both shrouds and the alternator off, and then there's 4 bolts that hold the pump bracket to the block. And it really, to me, is a lot simpler just to take the whole thing out. Thing you have to watch is there's a bracket on the back side of the power steering pump that the battery cables and the pump, they're a real bugger to get at because those battery cables are in the way. You kind of have to wiggle things around a little bit. Remember, on the back of the power steering is the one bracket that bolts right to the block. You have to remember which side of that bracket the battery cables go on, and then which side the two lines for the power steering pump go on. You want to start the 4 bolts that are in the front of the bracket that go back into the block. Make sure they get started. One of them you have to get underneath the rig to get it started, the one on the very bottom. And then you want to get the bolt on that little bracket on the back of the pump that bolts to the block in place before you start to tighten any of them. I think here I started with a bolt on top just to get things held into place. Then I start a couple of the others, and then I have to go down underneath to get the one on the bottom started. The 4 bolts on the front are relatively easy to get started, except the one on the bottom. I think I said before, a couple of videos I watched, they took the pump off of that bracket, and it's just way easier to get that bracket out of the way, because otherwise you got to try and pull that pulley off of the pump before you can unbolt the pump, and there just isn't much room in there. You want to make sure when you're getting that bracket on that you have enough room to push the high pressure line that goes from the pump to the power steering behind the bracket, so you can get it down below and hook it up to the bracket on the back of the pump. You may have to turn that bracket a little bit to get things lined up, but you want to make darn sure that you're not getting that hose cross-threaded into that bracket, because there are not that many threads on it, and if you cross-thread it and screw it up, well, you're probably going to end up with a leak and either have to get the bracket or another hose because the threads are boogered up. Once you make sure everything is in the right place, well, you can go ahead and tighten up the 4 front bolts on the bracket and the one on the back of this power steering pump that goes into the block. It's not got much room, so it's a bugger. Okay, you can see I'm down here underneath trying to tighten the high pressure hose. These are cracks in the belt for the AC. There's no sense of putting them back on, so took a little break, went and got both the AC belt and the fan belt at the parts house and came back. The problem is, if that AC belt goes, in order to put it back on, you got to pull the radiator and the fan and some other stuff, the shroud, to be able to get into it. And I'm trying to get the alternator put on. There are 2 little slip bushings in there. You have to make sure they're spread out enough you can get the alternator back in, and then once you tighten the bolts down, they will suck it up tight. Okay, I got the belts on. There's usually a diagram on the front of the rig in case you forget how. Now I'm getting ready. I'll put the bottom shroud back in. You got to put the bottom shroud in before you go ahead and put the fan on. Once you get the fan started, you don't have to tighten it super tight, because the spin on the engine will automatically tighten it up some. There are two ears on that bottom shroud that hook into some brackets on the radiator about halfway up. You want to make sure those are in place before you get the fan on and try and put the top shroud on, because the top shroud will bolt back to that bottom bracket, and then there's two bolts on the top of it that help hold it on. Like I said, you get the fan started. Well, it doesn't have to be super tight because it will tighten itself. Once the top shroud is in place with everything holding it down, there's a bracket for the radiator hose that's tied back to go on. Once the hose is in place with the bracket, then you can go ahead and install the air intake. I can't remember if there are 2 or 4 plastic pins that lock the two shrouds together on each side. And then on the top of the shroud there are 2 bolts that it bolts into the bracket that holds the radiator and the AC condenser. Here I'm putting the top screws in the shroud to hold it to the bracket. I didn't mention it before, but anytime I work with an exposed radiator on a job like this, why I usually try and put a piece of cardboard or plywood on the back side of the radiator just to keep from bumping the fins and bending them over. Now is a good time to double check that hook on the bottom radiator shroud to make sure that it's in place before you get the top one done, because if you get the top one tight and the bottom one isn't hooked together, why it's going to end up flopping around and probably go into the fan. Here's the air box going back into place. You got 2 5/16 hose clamps to get it down where it belongs. Remember, you have to put the top radiator hose along the shroud before you put this box on. I believe you'll see right here I forgot to untie that radiator hose and pull it over. It's a little bit of a fight to get that bottom box that fits on that's on the bottom of that air box to go down in between the block and tighten up the two clamps for the air intakes. And I believe the only thing left to do is to Tighten up the battery cables.